Hello and welcome to another Art in Conversation as part of NOVA, National Association of Women Artists series. Our today artist and NOVA member is Monica Shulman. She's a talented artist and active member of National Association of Women Artists. Monica, welcome to our conversation.
Thank you so much, Farrin. It's so nice to be here with you.
Thank you. Thank you for accepting to be our guest artist of the month. Um, Monica, as always, we started with you explaining a little bit about yourself and how you become interested in art and what type of art you're doing. So I let you introduce yourself.
So I've always been an artist. As a child, I took painting lessons and I learned how to draw with charcoals and then eventually oil paints. My dad is a professional, well, he's a professional dad, but he's an amateur photographer. And so we used to develop pictures in my basement. So I always had this sort of affinity for photography. My mom collects art. So I've always been surrounded by art. But even with like this sort of very artistic background, I ended up in law school. And so art is my second career. After I sort of, I burned out from being a lawyer. By the time I was 30 years old, I was a corporate finance lawyer. I started exploring photography again, and I launched an art and photography blog back when like blogs were not really a thing. And I kind of started to immerse myself in the art world. But it wasn't until I moved to the lower Hudson Valley where I live now that I opened up my studio. And after like over 20 years, I picked up a paintbrush and started painting again. Um,
Mhm.
and I think because I started my career as a photographer, I had a very strong sense of light and structure and subject. And eventually I became more interested in the background scene and what was happening in the negative space. And that is how my abstract language sort of organically evolved. I was focusing more on what was behind my intended subject, and that abstract language just like developed basically on its own. So I would say that I'm primarily self-taught. I have a lot of like silent mentors, and my work is primarily rooted in abstract expressionism. Um,
Mhm.
and I would say that my work is almost like memoir to me. And we were talking about that earlier. It's completely autobiographical. My work is the stories of my life, and I tell those stories through layer and color and texture and lines and marks and whatever's happening in that moment in time in my life. That's how my work gets born. So a lot of my
Mhm.
former career as a lawyer and as a photographer directly informs my work as a painter. I bring all the parts of myself into my art practice.
Yeah,
And
very interesting. A lawyer, an artist, and photographer. Means
it's funny, right? Because I used to fight that part of myself so much because I get hyper focused on things. And I think I
maybe
was
that's your lawyer, your law side.
well, that's why I say that my art practice is really informed by my last career because it used to be that the two sides of my brain were constantly fighting each other. And now I really think that they are having conversation and collaborating. And I think that, you know, I feel that my work is successful because I don't fight those parts of myself anymore. And I let all those
Mm,
parts of myself come into play when I'm creating art. And I sort of
mm,
like invite them in. It's
okay.
my materials are active participants in my work, just like my history becomes an active participant in my work.
Mm, yeah, very interesting. Wow.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
it does. I think it makes sense, you know.
Well, the
Um,
book also, I always say about my work, it has a very clear beginning and a very clear end. And what happens
okay.
in the middle is sort of unpredictable, right? And
Okay.
so
Understand.
that's how the story gets told. So,
Okay. That's very important, you know, to know where you start and when where you end, you know.
yes,
The rest is just consider a labor
right.
in between, you know. So that's at least your life and your work are not confusing.
No, well, sometimes sometimes, I try not to overcomplicate things because I do tend to be like a chronic overthinker. And I think that one of the things that my art practice has given me is the ability to just be in a moment in time without
Okay.
constantly overthinking. And you're showing my photographs here. These are just, I mean, I have thousands, right? But I chose these four because I'm always looking at a scene, and I consider myself a street photographer and somebody who's always looking for moments and stories to happen in front of me. And I think that as a painter, I'm telling the stories the way that I want to tell them. My own narrative comes into play. Whereas as
Mhm.
a photographer, I was just always observing scenes and making up the stories that I wanted to make up about what I was seeing. So I was chasing light and creating narratives. And so where I would go out with my camera and try to invent stories, this sort of study of light and moments brought me to where I am now as a painter.
The painting. Are you painting or based on the photo you took or?
Sometimes I do. I did select a few paintings to show you that are based on photos, particularly this one in the top left, These City Lights, that's in New York City. And, you know, the way that I'm thinking about structure and light in that sense, yes, my photography and my eye for photography comes into what my paintings are.
Mhm.
Um, but in terms of the story, like I would capture, I love to capture people on the street and subjects and imagine
I,
what their lives must be like. But when I started to create abstract figurative work later on, and this is, we'll talk about it, but um, all of the people that I draw are versions of me and versions of
okay.
myself. And I think that eventually, depending on who's looking at them and what your story is, they become like this. I draw mostly
Yeah, the
women.
story.
They become like
Yeah.
the collective woman, a piece of all of us. But it's like that shared humanity that I love capturing with people that I photograph on the
Mhm.
street, whether I know them or whether I don't. But it's really just a study of light and structure and shape and what's happening in that moment.
Mhm. So the subject of your work majority are cityscape or like, people in a sense.
In photography, yes. I mean, I do love landscape. I love capturing the water. I'm very drawn to the ocean. I'm very drawn to bodies of water. In fact, living here where I live in the lower Hudson Valley, I get a lot of energy from the river. It's a very charged place. There's a lot of
Mhm.
history here. It's a very rich history. And I know, a lot went on here, and there is that anchor of the Hudson River, and I feel very inspired by it. My studio actually looks out to the Hudson River, so I have a clear view, especially in the wintertime, of the Palisades and the river, and it's that mighty Hudson. It really it really inspires me.
Inspiring.
It inspires my work. Yes, I'm very
I'm
inspired
sure.
by nature in a way that I never thought that I would be.
Yeah, I'm sure it's beautiful view. I can imagine.
It is beautiful.
So your work, what type of like today, what you known with? Which of your artwork or media, photography or painting, which one today you known or
I would
you
say I'm
consider?
mostly now known for my work as an abstract expressionist painter, and I paint with oils. So
Okay.
when I do some mixed media work, and that's mostly, layering um, gesso and oil sticks and oil
Okay.
pastel and oil paint. Those
But
are
those
those.
are your recent work, right? As I saw, I think your recent work, you start to work more with mixed media.
Yes, but that's think with this sort of very colorful rhythmic painting, impasto style painting. That's what I would say I'm primarily known for. And my
Okay.
history as a photographer is definitely, a lot of people know me for my photography, but I've kind of evolved beyond that now into working primarily as an abstract painter. So
So
this
the sky's the limit.
Yes.
Uh,
So this piece actually was a commission, and I love the challenges of commissions because my clients often ask me, I love this piece of work that you made that was displayed here, or I saw this piece in this show, but I need something larger, or I need something in this way. And I love sort of marrying my vision with my clients' needs, but also knowing that my clients trust me to create something that is very uniquely from my point of view, tells their story. But what I really enjoy about working in abstract is that my story is one thing, right? But my clients are, or my, my collectors, or even somebody who's just viewing my artwork in a show will bring their own story and their own narrative into the work and what they see. And then we have sort of growing this shared history on a canvas. And I think that it kind of, it unites us really. So I make it first for me, right? It's an internal experience, but people necessarily have to make it about themselves when they're looking at something. What memory does that evoke? What feeling does that evoke? And I'm always curious about that, even though first I have to make it for myself. And first the painting has to be about me first, and then the story that I'm trying to tell. But what I love about the challenge of a commission painting is that I get to know my clients and I bring their story into it, and it kind of molds together.
You merge their story with your story.
It's capturing their essence, but from my point of view.
Yeah,
so
okay.
it's like I have to weave myself into everything that I make. And I think that when someone trusts me to tell their story through my art, it's like a marriage of sorts.
Yeah. You telling from your perspective.
That's right. But I think I try to achieve that through all of my work. It's telling my own perspective and my own story. You can't be there with me in all the moments that I'm telling about, right? It is memoir, it's sharing bits of myself. But I can't be there with you when you are interpreting my artwork,
It makes sense.
It's the subjective nature of art, but it's also just like what we're drawn to and what we bring to any table at any given moment.
I understand. Yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah.
So, how about this work? What's the story behind this painting?
Echo of the Valley, Dawn. So I actually did my first artist residency last summer in Northern Italy, and it was just such a tremendous experience. I was invited actually by a fellow Nawa artist based out of Minneapolis, Ayenga Bokamba, and we had done a show together at Freeze LA. And then I met her when she came to New York to speak on a panel, and immediately we hit it off. And then we discovered, we're both Nawa members. And it's funny how, I always say the universe puts people in our path, right?
Yes.
And she had completed a residency, rural contemporary in the Italian Alps several times. And she was assembling a group of women artists to take sort of like, this leap of faith to go on this residency together. And it was a 1-week residency. And my work takes a very long time. It's oil paint, so it takes a long time to dry. And that's one of the things that my art practice has given me. And also I think parenting, right? But this heightened sense of needing to be patient, and that your choices, every choice that you make will have an impact on someone, or in this case, on my artwork, right? Like I have to be very patient. Otherwise I work in oils. It'll just be a muddy mess if I go into it too soon. And when I was on this residency, first, it was my first residency. And secondly, it was my first time being away from my family for that period of time to do something like this for myself. And on that first night in this beautiful ancestral home in the Italian Alps, surrounded by the Alps in this valley called the Val Camonica Valley near Breno, Italy, there was this terrible storm and it shook the whole house. It had been a beautiful day and it felt like the walls were going to come crumbling down, but I had to remind myself, like, I'm safe. Everything is fine. Nothing is going to happen to me here. The whole house, the shutters were rattling, and it felt like, I don't know, it felt like a sign, right? From the universe, like I'm where I'm supposed to be. And there was this tremendous echo that was happening because the thunder would rattle the house, but it was also booming off of the sides of these beautiful Concarena mountains that was around in the Alps. There's such a history there, particularly after the world wars. And all that happened in this part of the world. And it just felt like there was a lot of energy swirling around. And in the morning when I woke up, I felt like so alive. I felt like, wow, I'm really going to enjoy this residency. I loved being in community. I loved being with these other artists who were there as an international program. I loved sharing our stories. Our art practice is so solitary. I'm in my studio and I have to be by myself. And sometimes with so many distractions in the world, I love just the silence of my art practice. This residency really gave me an opportunity to be alone with my practice, wake up every morning, go for a hike. Always start my day with movement, no matter where I am. And then having the evenings to be with other artists and talk about our art practices, about the world, about life, about our ideas, about our fears, our hopes, just these really beautiful organic conversations that flowed. And just being part of that community, it felt very very welcoming, but it also felt very like healing in a way, right? Like my work is very process oriented, but I often feel so rushed because I'm pressed for time. I have there's only so many hours in the day. I have two children, and being away from my family, I mean, it made me miss them so much, but it also gave me time to really focus in on myself and do a lot of examining and uncovering.
Mm.
I couldn't have created this work here. I needed to go and see all the things that I saw there. We
Mm.
explored so much of the area. Um, we had a tour with an archaeologist in Fopa which is a UNESCO site with these rock drawings and engravings from the Copper Age and the Bronze Age, and just the history of the place and learning about ancient civilization, something that is like a side interest of mine. And just feeling like just very connected to nature and to other people. It was really beautiful, and there was a lot of intensity. And so these colors that I created, I had a series of three paintings, and the residency culminated in an art show inside a 15th century chiesa in Brno, and it was just absolutely a magical, life-changing experience to have contemporary artworks inside this medieval deconsecrated church.
Yeah.
Was just it was a lot of it was like a lot of layers that came into it, right? And it was really a very moving and very important time. And I could not have created this work had I not gone there. These colors, the way that it just kind of flowed out of me. I talked about it a lot on my website and on my blog and on my Instagram.
So
Um,
you created tree work while you were in
well,
residency?
I actually have another piece here. I created three works and a lot of drawings.
Okay.
So there's a bit of a glare here because it's behind
Okay.
plastic.
Yeah.
These works, and now they're sort of they're inspiring a new body of work that I'm making now. But this is a mixed media, also oil pastel layered. There's just a lot of a lot of inviting of things in that I didn't even know I had inside of me until I had gone to this place. So it really gave me a lot. So it was like a literal echo in this valley, but also like an echo in myself. It was like a mirror almost. It was a
Yeah.
really beautiful experience. And
So how about this painting? This is not part of that series, right? Or
no, it is not. So this painting is from 2018, and it's called Avenue.
Mm.
And I lived in Manhattan for over a decade. And when I first moved to the lower Hudson Valley, it took me about 18 months to really feel like I was regulated in my body. I felt very dysregulated here for a long time. I found all of the nature to be almost jarring, right? Like all the green. It felt like almost like offensive to my eyes because I had lived so much time in the city with this like very frenetic energy and this nonstop movement. And I didn't really realize that it was not normal for me until I left and how unnatural it felt. Um,
You know
and
what? I relate to you because it happened to me when I
Mhm.
moved from the city.
Yeah. Yeah. And like now, and I mean, there's a reason why There's no place like it, right? There's no place like New York. That vibe, that feeling of, doing more in a day before than most people will do in a year. Sometimes you feel like in New York, and like
Yeah.
this feeling of like you're very much alone. Like I've had moments in New York where, I've cried on the subway, I've cried in public, I've seen, you know, things that I would never imagine seeing in a public place. I've experienced things. I've had joys. I've had sadness.
Yeah.
Um,
I
all of
understand.
that.
Time goes faster,
Time
you know.
goes faster, but all along those moments and experiences, New York was it was like a friend alongside of me, letting me just absorbing all of me and accepting me for who I was. And I love that about New York. But now, like I'll always come to New York. I'll always love New York, and I'll always regard it sort of as like an old friend, from my past that I no longer
I
in my
like it. I
life.
like it. Old friends. You haven't
Yeah.
thought about it. It's
And
nice.
but it was a very living in New York City was a very important part of my story and my trajectory. And if I hadn't left, though, I don't think I would have my art practice the way that I have my art practice now.
I understand.
So with this painting, what I was trying to capture was particularly that photograph that we showed in the beginning, these city lights. I took that
Mhm.
picture from the High Line looking down on 14th Street. And always trying to capture these sort of abstract moments of New York City. And you saw all these lights and these people and this movement and this activity, and that um, it's all happening there, right? Like in a concrete way, it's happening, but in an abstract way, the way you interpret it is something different. And these colors, this sort of like black, it's a carbon black color, ivory black, all different tones mixed in. And typically I don't layer lighter colors over that, right? But it made sense here. I had to wait for all of that to dry and then go over it again and add all these colors, this energy, this movement. Um, they felt almost like equally as chaotic as it is calming, because the
Exactly.
colors feel very optimistic to me and they feel very promising to me. And it's very calming, even though it can feel very frenetic and a bit chaotic. And I think I think if you ask any number of New Yorkers, they might tell you that in a day you can have all of those emotions and more. You can feel like totally out of your body, wake up in the morning, you're angry, you're on the subway, somebody makes you late, or the bus doesn't come, or whatever, your coffee's cold. But then you kind of feel like, oh my God, but I'm lucky to live here. And the sky is blue. And, there's a little patch of grass. And tonight I'm going to go out for drinks with my friends, or I'm going to go for a walk in Central Park or wherever. And it can feel like very hopeful. And I love that that's the vibe and energy of New York City. And
Yeah.
I carry that with me as a very inspiring and important piece of my past that,
Yeah.
as I
Understand.
said, like
I mean,
it's like
I understand also the explanation that you said chaotic,
Mhm.
at the same time calm, you know. And
Yes,
the explanation you saying as a person also lived in the city for 10 years, over 10 years. So I had that feeling and I understand it completely.
right. Yeah,
You
I think
get
if you've ever
this.
lived in New York, you can understand that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So this piece, wow, this piece was something. So it's called Woman. And again, it's about that energy and the movement. I made it in 2021 after I had been working on a body of work that was abstract figurative during the pandemic lockdown. And basically, during the pandemic lockdown, I had only been drawing in my sketchbooks and writing for nearly a year. I do a lot of writing, a longhand. I have very many journals. I always say that, my kids are going to inherit many books of my handwriting that probably only I can read, but between my journals and my notes app, I'm constantly writing. And I did a lot of that during the pandemic. But afterward, I started to come back to my comfort zone, which is abstract expressionism. And I was thinking that even though it was my comfort zone, nothing about it was comfortable. We had all gone through this collective global trauma. And I was starting to move away from more muted tones. I had worked a lot with prior to the pandemic with like a lot of like softer tones and colors. And I was moving kind of toward wanting to experiment with warmer, more intense colors and marks and strokes that, like I said before, it almost felt like an emergency. And it was just a lot of intensity, and these strokes and colors were sometimes they're planned, sometimes they're not, but I have an idea about what I want to create, but then it just happens completely intuitively. Um, and I really use my whole body to create this work, right? Like it's very physical and it's very tiring because even if the piece is not, I wouldn't consider a 48 by 36 to be so large. I work in much larger pieces, like the one that I just showed you, Avenue, is a much larger piece of canvas that I had to adhere to the wall, and that is very, ladders and moving and moving, stretching and getting on multiple surfaces to paint it. But it felt like in that moment in time, I was coming back to myself as a painter and as an artist back in my studio, because during the pandemic, I had to bring home a lot of my materials and I don't have the space here. And my children were only 6 and 9 years old. So they were small and we were scared. We didn't know what was happening, right? And so I wasn't really like, my art practice took a very necessary back seat. I mean, my mental health took a backseat too, but when I went back to the studio and I started to make these works, especially since I had been working much smaller format, my notebooks are my visual journals, I call them, but they're mostly, 11 by 14, 12 by 16. They're not very big. And going back to working in larger surfaces and back to my oil paints, because in my home studio, which is not, I don't even have a home studio anymore. It's really just a space in the basement. I can't work in oils down there.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, I understand.
it was really forcing myself to, okay, I have to keep working I have to keep working to keep my creativity going. And I needed that in order to stay healthy in my mind, right? During the pandemic. So even if I couldn't make the work that I was so accustomed to making, that I loved to make, I had to do something. And that's where my abstract figurative art work started to be born. And out of these ideas and, a lot of processing that I did of past events in my life during the pandemic happened. And this whole body of work was born from that. But getting back to the studio was kind of like this, it felt like a coming home to myself
I
too. And that's
understand.
why I named this woman, because, these varying degrees of color and shade and the tones and the abrupt movement of all the strokes and the marks, the drips and the layers. It's hard to tell on a screen, but my work is very heavily layered. And so I'm planning, I think about I think I know what I want the work to look like at the end, but there's a lot of planning that has to come into play because I know what I want the final product, but all of that has to come through from the washes and from the underlayers and things too.
Mm-hmm. Wow. So this is more about you as a woman.
Yes.
And after, yeah, that makes sense. So I think everybody can relate to that. So it's about you, but also about other women,
It's
which they were in the same
I
situation.
think I think a collective woman, and I think that this piece, I put it first before some of the other works that we're going to talk about, even though it came later, because and then it'll be a full circle moment, I think, and it makes more sense. But I think that we have so much in common, and our experiences. When you get to know people, you realize we're not that different from each other. And I think that that's when I talk about a shared history on my canvas, that's what I mean, right? Like
Yeah,
and your point of view matters to me. I mean, my point of view has to come first, right? Because I'm making the work and I'm the
yeah,
artist. But how you connect to it matters to me too.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I understand. I understand. So it's about a circle, a cycle. It's
Yes.
not about one, singular person. It's about a cycle, which is all goes back.
Well, it's like a photograph too, right? It's a moment in time.
Yeah.
That picture, a photo happens once. That's it. Once the moment passes, the light changes, a person moves, a wave crashes, a car moves, anything, right? It's like
Mhm.
a butterfly effect. You capture that moment or you don't. That's it. You're experiencing it. And I think similarly for painting, something that I painted in, you know, 2015 or whenever, when I have paintings from when I was a young child. I have beautiful paintings from, as my kids say, the 1900s, like from 1993 and 1991 and 1994. And I have a lot of paintings and drawings from that time. And I like to look back and think, what was that, 15-year-old me thinking about, that 16-year-old me thinking about?
Mm.
And what is that? How much of that young girl do I bring to what I'm making now? It's a moment.
Yeah.
Just like it's a snapshot, but it's a real thing that happened.
Yeah. I understand.
Yeah.
So I know we're almost at the end of our conversation, if you can believe
No, I told you I'm a terrible editor.
it. So we have to just scan through some of this work and briefly explain if you and wrap up our conversation. I know your work are, as you said, are quite the storytelling.
Yes.
Um,
We can always go longer and you can edit it if you'd like to do that too.
so do you want to scan through some of the work and see?
Sure. I'll tell about the piece that you just showed before. It's called We Need to Stop, and that's actually
Yes.
that's
Okay.
going to be in a show in October. The next piece, the next one. So this piece will be in a show in October. I borrowed this line from my therapist, who always says that at the end of our sessions, and I think therapy is really the ultimate self-care. But you do need to stop and reflect. So that's why I named it this. But the next piece is something that I painted in 2019, but I didn't name it until much later. It was the last piece that I created before the pandemic, and it was inspired by this trip that we took to Sicily after a family wedding in Lake Como. And I was really inspired by the colors of Sicily. And we went to Agrigento to visit this historic site. I'm very interested in ancient civilizations and just world history in general. We talked about that a little bit ago. But all these colors were inspired by the heat and the culture and the history of the place, but I didn't name it until after the pandemic. I thought a lot about this painting that was drying in my studio while I was at home during the pandemic, and I started to think a lot about like how ancient civilizations handled plague and illness and war and disease and horrible moments in time in history. And meanwhile, in the United States, at least, like people were like obsessing about toilet paper and like it felt like we kind of like we lost the plot a little bit in 2020,
Yeah.
you know? And it felt like, what are we doing? Like what are we looking for? What are we seeking? And so when I got back to my studio, I went to my studio like every few weeks, all masked up so that I can water my plants. I have a lot of plants in my studio. And I would sit and stare like and I at this painting that was up on the shelf drying. And I thought, like feeling kind of desperate in the lockdown, like trying to channel what other people had gone throughout history. And I was just trying to stay positive and remembering this moment in time in life that I had taken this amazing trip with my children and my parents and my husband, and we just it was a really beautiful time. But it meant something else after the COVID lockdowns.
Yeah. So that's the title, What You Seek,
Yes, yes,
It's
yeah,
quite actually represent the piece.
yeah.
Mm.
And this painting, Hide and Seek, is very intense and special to me. It's sold. It lives in California, and it's one of those paintings that I regretted selling almost immediately after I sold it. But I was thinking about all the masks that we wear, the people that we once were, and how we try to hide the different parts of ourselves. But really, it's like about how we evolve and how all those pieces are so important to our history and our whole story, even the parts that we don't really love about ourselves. And so I created this piece as well as the next two on the next slide. The other pieces were studies and vortex and labyrinth. and hide and seek. And there's a fourth piece too that I didn't include here, but they all sort of tell these stories. And sometimes I make studies and sometimes I don't. In this case, I did because I was experimenting with these different colors and sort of like color blocking a little bit here. And I was thinking just about how our personalities can change depending on our circumstances or our situation,
Mhm.
what we're going through in a moment, and how we can't really deny who we are, even when we're not our best.
Exactly.
So, and the other piece of it is that, other people's opinions of us don't really matter. And
Mhm.
so we just have to grow within ourselves. So these are the abstract, figurative works that I created during the pandemic. So I actually had gone through a very long bout of infertility, and I had gone through infertility treatments and IVF, and I experienced, some loss and postpartum depression and things that I had not really processed at all
Mhm.
prior to the pandemic because I was busy raising my family and just wanted to sort of move beyond uh, what was a very traumatic experience for me. And when I was in the lockdown, when we were here, and I was drawing in my books, I started to draw. And I was talking about that before. I was drawing these figures, and they all these women that I was drawing were really just me, right? They were all me, but they started to become like this collective woman. And the body of work that I created. This is a drawing of my husband and me. And again, this is another piece that is sold. And again, I was like, why did I sell that? But I have to put them out into the world, right? Like I can't, I would just hoard all of my artwork if not. And I
Yeah.
create them for myself, but they have to be out there in the world. I had this dream about poppies and the poppy flower. I do work sometimes a lot off of my own dreams, and they come into play in and sometimes I forget them, right? But sometimes I just like sit with them. Um, and try to imagine like what could that have meant. When I had IVF, I had both times in my IVF experiences, I had 9 embryos.
Mhm.
So unusual. Why did I have 9 embryos? It was like both times 9 embryos, and I had one child each time, um, and I each time that I went through the process, and I had a dream about poppy flowers, and I was like running through the field, and I mean, the dreams that I was having during the lockdown, during in the early days of the pandemic, were just like so bizarre, and I would wake up and be like, "What was that?" And I started to keep a dream diary, and I had this like recurring dream with these flowers, and I have this book of symbols that my sister gave me many years ago, and I have it in the studio. And every time I look something up, I put the date because I want to see like why was that? Why was I looking this thing up? Like why did I feel like I had to study this? Because I tend to go down these like really intense rabbit holes and try to, I'm a lifelong learner, and I try to figure out, what's at the bottom of this. And the poppy flower obviously is a flower that's used for remembrance, but it's also it's a very delicate flower, but it's rooted in strength. So
Mhm.
when you pick it, if you don't burn the end, the flower just basically dies. If you
Yeah.
put it in water, it'll wilt like immediately. And I was thinking
Yeah.
of myself as like this poppy flower that is in the ground, very strong, but like I picked it and it felt like I was falling apart.
Mhm.
And so this piece, a love
So
comes
that's
like
the reason you have poppy almost in.
these are the reasons why the majority of my women always have flowers around them. So on the left are 4 flowers, and those are myself and my husband and our 2 kids. And on the right and this happened like totally by accident, but on the right are 18 flowers. So those are my 9 embryos 2 times. And 18 happens to be my lucky number. Um, and this was like a woman coming out of like the darkness, I felt like at night, right? Like, and I was
Yeah.
just like hiding. And I feel very naked when I'm painting. I feel very naked when I'm talking about my work. It feels very vulnerable, right? But like that
Yeah.
vulnerability, I think is what makes us who we are. And I think that
Yeah.
vulnerability um, is what unites us really. And like this entire collection was like at the intersection of femininity and fertility, freedom, sexuality. It was exploring, and I was seeking to like sort of uncover that fragility and that power and that beauty. uh,
Yeah.
of the female spirit and like how we tell our stories and who we are and who we become.
Yeah. So I know we can talk about our work, sit here for a month, and your work obviously are so meaningful and storytelling. But we are at the end of our conversation. And Monica has this beautiful website with all her work, which is quite easy to navigate and see and, understand, and also to reach out to her, which is I also have the information and the website and Instagram and Facebook, everything. If anyone, they want more information and see more of your artwork, they can reach. Monica, just to finish and wrap up our work, do you have any last word or message for our fellow artists?
I would just say to keep working, keep telling your stories, keep learning. One of my mantras is keep at it. And I think that it's important to just always keep believing in what you're doing and telling your stories and being open to new ideas and new ways.
Yeah, that's actually true. Be open and just keep working and keep going. Thank you very much, Monica. We really appreciate your conversation and sharing your story. Beautiful work.
Thank you so much.
And we appreciate. And so keep creating.
Thank you. Thank you, Farine. Thank you so much for having me. This has been so much fun, an honor.
Thank
Really.
you.
Thank you.